On War, Volumes 2 and 3, by Carl von Clausewitz, translated by J. Graham. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Book 5, Chapters 1 through 4. General Scheme. We shall consider military forces, 1. As regards their numerical strength, 2. In their state independent of fighting, 3. In respect of their maintenance, and lastly, 4. In their general relations to country and ground. Thus we shall devote this book to the consideration of things appertaining to an army, which only come under the head of necessary conditions of fighting, but do not constitute the fight itself. They stand in more or less close connection with, and react upon the fighting, and therefore in consideration and application of the combat they must often appear. But we must first consider each by itself as a whole, in its essence and peculiarities. Chapter 2. Theatre of War, Army, Campaign. The nature of things does not allow of a completely satisfactory definition of these factors, denoting respectively space, mass, and time in war. But that we may not sometimes be quite misunderstood, we must try to make somewhat plainer the usual meaning of these terms, to which we shall in most cases adhere. 1. Theatre of War. This term denotes properly such a portion of the space over which war prevails as has its boundaries protected, and thus possesses a kind of independence. This protection may consist in fortresses, or important natural obstacles presented by the country, or even by its being separated by a considerable distance from the rest of the space embraced in the war. Such a portion is not a mere piece of the whole, but a small whole complete in itself, and consequently is more or less in such a condition that changes which take place at other points in the seat of war have only an indirect and no direct influence upon it. To give an adequate idea of this, we may suppose that on this portion an advance is made, whilst in another quarter a retreat is taking place, or upon the one the army is acting defensively, whilst an offensive is being carried on upon the other. Such a clearly defined idea as this is not capable of universal application. It is here used merely to indicate the line of distinction. 2. Army. With the assistance of the conception of a theatre of war, it is very easy to say what an army is. It is, in point of fact, the mass of troops in the same theatre of war. But this plainly does not include all that is meant by the term in its common usage. Blucher and Wellington commanded each a separate army in 1815, although the two were in the same theatre of war. The chief command is, therefore, another distinguishing sign for the conception of an army. At the same time, this sign is very nearly allied to the preceding, for where things are well organised there should only exist one supreme command in a theatre of war, and the commander-in-chief in a particular theatre of war should always have a proportionate degree of independence. The mere absolute numerical strength of a body of troops is less decisive on the subject than at first might appear, for where several armies are acting under one command, and upon one and the same theatre of war, they are called armies not by reason of their strength, but from the relations antecedent to the war (1813, the Silesian army, the army of the north, etc.). And although we should divide a great mass of troops intended to remain in the same theatre of war into corps, we should never divide them into armies. At least such a division would be contrary to what seems to be the meaning which is universally attached to the term. On the other hand, it would certainly be pedantry to apply the term army to each band of irregular troops acting independently in a remote province. Still, we must not leave unnoticed that it surprises no one when the army of the Vendeans in the Revolutionary War is spoken of, and yet it was not much stronger. The conceptions of army and theatre of war, therefore, as a rule, go together, and mutually include each other. 3. Campaign. Although the sum of all military events which happen in all the theatres of war in one year is often called a campaign, still, however, it is more usual and more exact to understand by the term the events in one single theatre of war. But it is worse still to connect the notion of a campaign with a period of 1 year, for wars no longer divide themselves naturally into campaigns of a year's duration by fixed and long periods in winter quarters. As, however, the events in a theatre of war of themselves form certain great chapters, if, for instance, the direct effects of some more or less great catastrophe cease, and new combinations begin to develop themselves. Therefore, these natural subdivisions must be taken into consideration in order to allot to each year campaign its complete share of events. No one would make the campaign of 1812 terminate at Memel, where the armies were on the 1st of January, and transfer the further retreat of the French until they crossed the Elbe to the campaign of 1813, as the further retreat was plainly only a part of the whole retreat from Moscow. That we cannot give these conceptions any greater degree of distinctness is of no consequence, because they cannot be used as philosophical definitions for the basis of any kind of propositions. They only serve to give a little more clearness and precision to the language we use. Chapter 3. Relation of Power. In the 8th chapter of the 3rd book we have spoken of the value of superior numbers in battles, from which follows as a consequence the superiority of numbers in general in strategy. So far the importance of the relations of power is established. We shall now add a few more detailed considerations on the subject. An unbiased examination of modern military history leads to the conviction that the superiority in numbers becomes every day more decisive. The principle of assembling the greatest possible numbers for a decisive battle may therefore be regarded as more important than ever. Courage and the spirit of an army have, in all ages, multiplied its physical powers, and will continue to do so equally in the future. But we find also that at certain periods in history, a superiority in the organisation and equipment of an army has given a great moral preponderance. We find that at other periods, a great superiority in mobility had a like effect. At one time, we see a new system of tactics brought to light. At another, we see the art of war developing itself in an effort to make a skilful use of ground on great general principles, and by such means, here and there, we find one general gaining great advantage over another. But even this tendency has disappeared, and wars now go on in a simpler and more natural manner. If, divesting ourselves of any preconceived notions, we look at the experiences of recent wars, we must admit that there are but little traces of any of the above influences, either throughout any whole campaign or in engagements of a decisive character, that is, the great battle, respecting which we refer to the 2nd chapter of the preceding book. Armies are, in our days, so much on a par in regard to arms, equipment, and drill, that there is no very notable difference between the best and the worst in these things. A difference may still be observed, resulting from the superior instruction of the scientific corps, but in general it only amounts to this, that one is the inventor and introducer of improved appliances, while the other immediately imitates. Even the subordinate generals, leaders of corps and divisions, in all that comes within the scope of their sphere, have in general everywhere the same ideas and methods, so that, except for the talent of the commander-in-chief, a thing entirely dependent on chance, and not bearing a constant relation to the standard of education amongst the people and the army, there is nothing now but habituation to war which can give one army a decided superiority over the other. The nearer we approach to a state of equality in all these things, the more decisive becomes the relation in point of numbers. The character of modern battles is the result of this state of equality. Take, for instance, the Battle of Borodino, where the first army in the world, the French, measured its strength with the Russian, which, in many parts of its organisation and in the education of its special branches, might be considered the furthest behindhand. In the whole battle there is not one single trace of superior art or intelligence. It is a mere trial of strength between the respective armies throughout, and as they were nearly equal in that respect, the result could not be otherwise than a gradual turn of the scale in favour of that side where there was the greatest energy on the part of the commander, and the most experience in war on the part of the troops. We have taken this battle as an illustration because in it there was an equality in the numbers on each side, such as is rarely to be found. We do not maintain that all battles exactly resemble this, but it shows the dominant tone of most of them. In a battle in which the forces try their strength on each other so leisurely and methodically, an exercise of force on one side must make the result in its favour much more certain, and it is a fact that we may search modern military history in vain for a battle in which an army has beaten double its own strength, an occurrence by no means uncommon in former times. Bonaparte, the greatest general of modern times, in all his great victorious battles, with one exception, that of Dresden, 1813, had managed to assemble an army superior in numbers, or at least very little inferior, to that of his opponents, and when it was impossible for him to do so, as at Leipzig, Brienne, Laon, and Belle Alliance, he was beaten. The absolute strength is in strategy generally a given quantity, which the commander cannot alter. But from this it by no means follows that it is impossible to carry on a war with a decidedly inferior force. War is not always a voluntary act of state policy, and least of all is it when the forces are very unequal. Consequently, any relation of force is imaginable in war, and it would be a strange theory of war which would wish to give up its office just when it is most wanted. However desirable theory may consider a proportionate force, still it cannot say that no use can be made of the most disproportionate. No limits can be prescribed in this respect. The weaker the force, the more moderate must be its object it proposes to itself, and the weaker the force, the shorter time it will last. In these two directions there is a field for weakness to give way, if we may use this expression. Of the changes which the measure of the force produces in the conduct of war, we can only speak by degrees, as these things present themselves. At present it is sufficient to have indicated the general point of view, but to complete that we shall add one more observation. The more that an army involved in an unequal combat falls short of the number of its opponents, the greater must be the tension of its powers, the greater its energy when danger presses. If the reverse takes place, and instead of heroic desperation, a spirit of despondency ensues, then certainly there is an end to every art of war. If with this energy of powers is combined a wise moderation in the object proposed, then there is that play of brilliant actions and prudent forbearances which we admire in the wars of Frederick the Great. But the less that this moderation and caution can effect, the more must the tension and energy of the forces become predominant. When the disproportion of forces is so great that no modification of our own object can ensure us safety from a catastrophe, or where the probable continuance of the danger is so great that the greatest economy of our powers can no longer suffice to bring us to our object, then the tension of our powers should be concentrated for one desperate blow. He who is pressed on all sides, expecting little help from things which promise none, will place his last and only reliance in the moral ascendancy which despair gives to courage, and look upon the greatest daring as the greatest wisdom. At the same time, employ the assistance of subtle stratagem, and if he does not succeed, will find in an honourable downfall the right to rise hereafter. Chapter 4. Relation of the three arms. We shall only speak of the three principal arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery. We must be excused for making the following analysis, which brings more to tactics, but is necessary to give distinctness to our ideas. The combat is of two kinds which are essentially different: the destructive principle of fire, and the hand-to-hand or personal combat. This latter again is either attack or defence. As we here speak of elements, attack and defence are to be understood in a perfectly absolute sense. Artillery obviously acts only with the destructive principle of fire, cavalry only with personal combat, infantry with both. In close combat, the essence of defence consists in standing firm, as if rooted to the ground. The essence of attack is movement. Cavalry is entirely deficient in the first quality. On the other hand, it possesses the latter in an especial manner. It is therefore only suited for attack. Infantry has especially the property of standing firm, but is not altogether without mobility. From this division of the elementary forces of war into different arms, we have as a result the superiority and general utility of infantry as compared with the other two arms, from it being the only arm which unites in itself all the three elementary forces. A further deduction is to be drawn that the combination of the three arms leads to a more perfect use of the forces, by affording the means of strengthening at pleasure either the one or the other of the principles which are united in an unalterable manner in infantry. The destructive principle of fire is, in the wars of the present time, plainly beyond measure the most effective. Nevertheless, the close combat, man to man, is just as plainly to be regarded as the real basis of combat. For that reason, therefore, an army of artillery would only be an absurdity in war, but an army of cavalry is conceivable, only it would possess very little intensity of force. An army of infantry alone is not only conceivable, but also much the strongest of the three. The three arms therefore stand in this order in reference to independent value: infantry, cavalry, artillery. But this order does not hold good if applied to the relative importance of each arm when they are all three acting in conjunction. As the destructive principle is much more effective than the principle of motion, therefore the complete want of cavalry would weaken an army less than the total want of artillery. An army consisting of infantry and artillery alone would certainly find itself in a disagreeable position if opposed to an army composed of all three arms. But if what it lacked in cavalry was compensated for by a proportionate increase of infantry, it would still, by somewhat different mode of acting, be able to do very well with its tactical economy. Its outpost services would cause some embarrassment, it would never be able to pursue a beaten enemy with great vivacity, and it would make a retreat with greater hardships and efforts, but these inconveniences would still never be sufficient in themselves to drive it completely out of the field. On the other hand, such an army opposed to one composed of infantry and cavalry only would be able to play a very good part, while it is hardly conceivable that the latter could keep the field at all against an army made up of all three arms. Of course, these reflections on the relative importance of each single arm result only from a consideration of the generality of events in war, where one case compensates another, and therefore it is not our intention to apply the truth thus ascertained to each individual case of a particular combat. A battalion on outpost service or on a retreat may, perhaps, choose to have with it a squadron in preference to a couple of guns. A body of cavalry with horse artillery, sent in rapid pursuit of, or to cut off, a flying enemy, wants no infantry, etc., etc. If we summarise the results of these considerations, they amount to this: 1. That the infantry is the most independent of the three arms. 2. Artillery is quite wanting in independence. 3. Infantry is the most important in the combination of the three arms. 4. Cavalry can the most easily be dispensed with. 5. A combination of the three arms gives the greatest strength. Now, if the combination of the three gives the greatest strength, it is natural to inquire what is the best absolute proportion of each, but that is a question which it is almost impossible to answer. If we could form a comparative estimate of the cost of organising in the first instance, and then provisioning and maintaining each of the three arms, and then again of the relative amount of services rendered by each in war, we should obtain a definite result which would give the best proportion in the abstract. But this is little more than a play of the imagination. The very first term in the comparison is difficult to determine. That is to say, one of the factors, the cost in money, is not difficult to find, but another, the value of men's lives, is a computation which no one would readily try to solve by figures. Also, the circumstance that each of the three arms chiefly depends on a different element of strength in the state, infantry on the number of the male population, cavalry on the number of horses, artillery on available financial means, introduces into the calculation some heterogeneous conditions, the overruling influence of which may be plainly observed in the great outlines of the history of different people at different periods. As, however, for other reasons, we cannot altogether dispense with some standard of comparison, therefore, in place of the whole of the first term of the comparison, we must take only that one of its factors which can be ascertained, namely the cost in money. Now, on this point, it is sufficient for our purposes to assume that, in general, a squadron of 150 horsemen, a battalion of infantry 800 strong, a battery of artillery consisting of 8 6-pounders, cost nearly the same, both as respects the expense of formation and of maintenance. With regard to the other member of the comparison, that is, how much service the one arm is capable of rendering as compared with the others, it is much less easy to find any distinct quantity. The thing might perhaps be possible if it depended merely on the destroying principle, but each arm is destined to its own particular use, therefore has its own particular sphere of action, which again is not so distinctly defined that it might not be greater or less through modification only in the mode of conducting the war, without causing any decided disadvantage. We are often told of what experience teaches on this subject, and it is supposed that military history affords the information necessary for a settlement of the question. But everyone must look upon all that as nothing more than a way of talking, which, as it is not derived from anything of a primary and necessary nature, does not deserve attention in an analytical examination. Now, although a fixed ratio as representing the best proportion between the three arms is conceivable, but is an X which it is impossible to find, a mere imaginary quantity, still it is possible to appreciate the effects of having a great superiority or a great inferiority in one particular arm as compared with the same arm in the enemy's army. Artillery increases the destructive principle of fire. It is the most redoubtable of arms, and its want therefore diminishes very considerably the intensive force of an army. On the other hand, it is the least movable, consequently makes an army more unwieldy. Further, it always requires a force for its support, because it is incapable of close combat. If it is too numerous, so that the troops appointed for its protection are not able to resist the attacks of the enemy at every point, it is often lost, and from that follows a fresh disadvantage, because of the three arms it is the only one which in its principal parts, that is, guns and carriages, the enemy can soon use against us. Cavalry increases the principle of mobility in an army. If too few in number, the brisk flame of the elements of war is thereby weakened, because everything must be done slower on foot. Everything must be organised with more care. The rich harvest of victory, instead of being cut with a scythe, can only be reaped with a sickle. An excess of cavalry can certainly never be looked upon as a direct diminution of the combative force, as an organic disproportion, but it may certainly be so indirectly on account of the difficulty of feeding that arm, and also if we reflect that instead of a surplus of 10,000 horsemen not required, we might have 50,000 infantry. These peculiarities arising from the preponderance of one arm are the more important to the art of war in its limited sense, as that art teaches the use of whatever forces are forthcoming, and when forces are placed under the command of a general, the proportion of the three arms is also commonly already settled, without his having had much voice in the matter. If we would form an idea of the character of warfare, modified by the preponderance of one or the other of the three arms, it is to be done in the following manner. An excess of artillery leads to a more defensive and passive character in our measures. Our interest will be to seek security in strong positions, great natural obstacles of ground, even in mountain positions, in order that the natural impediments we find in the ground may undertake the defence and protection of our numerous artillery, and that the enemy's force may come themselves and seek their own destruction. The whole war will be carried on in a serious, formal, minuet step. On the other hand, a want of artillery will make us prefer the offensive, the active, the mobile principle. Marching, fatigue, exertion become our special weapons. Thus the war will become more diversified, more lively, rougher. Small change is substituted for great events. With a very numerous cavalry, we seek wide plains, and take to great movements. At a greater distance from the enemy, we enjoy more rest and greater conveniences, without conferring the same advantages on our adversary. We may venture on bolder measures to outflank him, and on more daring movements generally, as we have command over space. In as far as diversions and invasions are true auxiliary means of war, we shall be able to make use of them with greater facility. A decided want of cavalry diminishes the force of mobility in an army without increasing its destructive power, as an excess of artillery does. Prudence and method then become the leading characteristics of the war. Always to remain near the enemy in order to keep him constantly in view. No rapid, still less hurried movements, everywhere a slow pushing on of well concentrated masses, a preference for the defensive and for broken country, and when the offensive must be resorted to, the shortest road direct to the centre of force in the enemy's army. These are the natural tendencies or principles in such cases. These different forms which warfare takes according as one or the other of the three arms preponderates, seldom have an influence so complete and decided as alone or chiefly to determine the direction of a whole undertaking. Whether we shall act strategically on the offensive or defensive, the choice of a theatre of war, the determination to fight a great battle or adopt some other means of destruction, are points which must be determined by other and more essential considerations. At least, if this is not the case, it is much to be feared that we have mistaken minor details for the chief consideration. But although this is so, although the great questions must be decided before on other grounds, there still always remains a certain margin for the influence of the preponderating arm, for in the offensive we can always be prudent and methodical, in the defensive bold and enterprising, etc., etc., through all the different stages and gradations of the military life. On the other hand, the nature of war may have a notable influence on the proportion of the three arms. First, a national war kept up by militia and a general levy (Landsturm) must naturally bring into the field a very numerous infantry, for in such wars there is a greater want of the means of equipment than of men, and as the equipment consequently is confined to what is indisputably necessary, we may easily imagine that for every battery of 8 pieces, not only 1 but 2 or 3 battalions might be raised. Second, if a weak state, opposed to a powerful one, cannot take refuge in a general call of the male population to regular military service, or in a militia system resembling it, then the increase of its artillery is certainly the shortest way of bringing up its weak army nearer to an equality with that of the enemy, for it saves men and intensifies the essential principle of military force, that is, the destructive principle. Anyway, such a state will mostly be confined to a limited theatre, and therefore this arm will be better suited to it. Frederick the Great adopted this means in the latter period of the 7 Years' War. Third, cavalry is the arm for movement and great decisions. Its increase beyond the ordinary proportions is therefore important if the war extends over a great space, if expeditions are to be made in various directions, and great and decisive blows are intended. Bonaparte is an example of this. That the offensive and defensive do not properly in themselves exercise an influence on the proportion of cavalry will only appear plainly when we come to speak of these two methods of acting in war. In the meantime we shall only remark that both assailant and defender as a rule traverse the same space in war, and may have also, at least in many cases, the same decisive intentions. We remind our readers of the campaigns of 1812. It is commonly believed that in the Middle Ages cavalry was much more numerous in proportion to infantry, and that the difference has been gradually on the decrease ever since. Yet this is a mistake, at least partially. The proportion of cavalry was, according to numbers, on the average perhaps not much greater. Of this we may convince ourselves by tracing through the history of the Middle Ages the detailed statements of the armed forces employed. Let us only think of the masses of men on foot who composed the armies of the Crusaders, or the masses who followed the emperors of Germany on their Roman expeditions. It was in reality the importance of the cavalry which was so much greater in those days. It was the stronger arm, composed of the flower of the people, so much that, although always very much weaker actually in numbers, it was still always looked upon as the chief thing. Infantry was little valued, hardly spoken of, hence has arisen the belief that its numbers were few. No doubt it happened oftener than it does now, that in incursions of small importance in France, Germany and Italy, a small army was composed entirely of cavalry. As it was the chief arm, there is nothing inconsistent in that, but these cases decide nothing if we take a general view, as they are greatly outnumbered by cases of greater armies of the period constituted differently. It was only when the obligations of military service imposed by the feudal law had ceased, and wars were carried on by soldiers enlisted, hired and paid, when, therefore, wars depended on money and enlistment, that is, at the time of the 30 Years' War, and the wars of Louis XIV., that this employment of great masses of almost useless infantry was checked, and perhaps in those days they might have fallen into exclusive use of cavalry, if infantry had not just then risen in importance through the improvements in firearms, by which means it maintained its numerical superiority in proportion to cavalry. At this period, if infantry was weak, the proportion was as 1 to 1, if numerous, as 3 to 1. Since then, cavalry has always decreased in importance, according as improvements in the use of firearms have advanced. This is intelligible enough in itself, but the improvement we speak of does not relate solely to the weapon itself and the skill of handling it. We advert also to the greater ability in using troops armed with the weapon. At the Battle of Mollwitz, the Prussian army had brought the fire of their infantry to such a state of perfection that there has been no improvement since then in that sense. On the other hand, the use of infantry in broken ground and as skirmishers has been introduced more recently, and is looked upon as a very great advance in the art of destruction. Our opinion is, therefore, that the relation of cavalry has not much changed as far as regards numbers, but as regards its importance there has been a great alteration. This seems to be a contradiction, but is not so in reality. The infantry of the Middle Ages, although forming the greater proportion of an army, did not attain to that proportion by its value as compared to cavalry, but because all that could not be appointed to the very costly cavalry were handed over to the infantry, this infantry was therefore merely a last resource, and if the number of cavalry had depended merely on the values set on that arm, it could never have been too great. Thus we can understand how cavalry, in spite of its constantly decreasing importance, may still perhaps have importance enough to keep its numerical relation at that point which it has hitherto so consistently maintained. It is a remarkable fact that, at least since the wars of the Austrian succession, the proportion of cavalry to infantry has changed very little, the variation being constantly between a fourth, a fifth, or a sixth. This seems to indicate that these proportions meet the natural requirements of an army, and that these numbers give the solution which it is impossible to find in a direct manner. We doubt, however, if this is the case, and we find the principal instances of the employment of a numerous cavalry sufficiently accounted for by other causes. Austria and Russia are states which have kept a numerous cavalry because they retain in their political condition the fragments of a Tartar organisation. Bonaparte, for his purpose, could never be strong enough in cavalry. When he had made use of the conscription as far as possible, he had no ways of strengthening his armies but by increasing the auxiliary arms, as they cost him more in money than in men. Besides this, it stands to reason that in military enterprises of such enormous extent as his, cavalry must have a greater value than in ordinary cases. Frederick the Great, it is well known, reckoned carefully every recruit that could be saved to his country. It was his great business to keep up the strength of his army as far as possible at the expense of other countries. His reasons for this are easy to conceive if we remember that his small dominions did not then include Prussia and the Westphalian provinces. Cavalry was kept complete by recruitment more easily than infantry, irrespective of fewer men being required, in addition to which his system of war was completely founded on the mobility of his army, and thus it was that while his infantry diminished in number, his cavalry was always increasing itself till the end of the 7 Years' War. Still, at the end of that war, it was hardly more than a fourth of the number of infantry that he had in the field. At the period referred to, there is no want of instances, also of armies entering the field unusually weak in cavalry, and yet carrying off the victory. The most remarkable is the Battle of Gross-Gerschen. If we only count the French divisions which took part in the battle, Bonaparte was 100,000 strong, of which 5,000 were cavalry, 90,000 infantry. The Allies had 70,000, of which 25,000 were cavalry and 40,000 infantry. Thus, in place of 20,000 cavalry on the side of the Allies, in excess of the total of French cavalry, Bonaparte had only 50,000 additional infantry, when he ought to have had 100,000. As he gained the battle with that superiority in infantry, we must ask whether it was at all likely that he would have lost if the proportions had been 140,000 to 40,000. Certainly the great advantage of our superiority in cavalry was shown immediately after the battle, for Bonaparte gained hardly any trophies for his victory. The gain of a battle is therefore not everything, but is it not always the chief thing? If we put together these considerations, we can hardly believe that the numerical proportion between the cavalry and infantry, which has existed for the last 80 years, is the natural one, founded solely on their absolute value. We are much rather inclined to think that after many fluctuations, the relative proportions of these arms will change further in the same direction as hitherto, and that the fixed number of cavalry will at last be considerably less. With respect to artillery, the number of guns has naturally increased since its first invention, and according as it has been made lighter and otherwise improved. Still, since the time of Frederick the Great, it has also kept very much to the same proportion of 2 or 3 guns per 1,000 men. We mean at the commencement of a campaign, for during its course artillery does not melt away as fast as infantry, therefore at the end of a campaign the proportion is generally notably greater, perhaps 3, 4 or 5 guns per 1,000 men. Whether this is the natural proportion, or the increase of artillery may be carried out still further, without prejudice to the whole conduct of the war, must be left for experience to decide. The principal results we obtain from the whole of these considerations are: 1. That infantry is the chief arm, to which the other two are subordinate. 2. That by the exercise of great skill and energy in command, the want of the two subordinate arms may in some measure be compensated for, provided that we are much stronger in infantry, and the better the infantry, the easier this may be done. 3. That it is more difficult to dispense with artillery than with cavalry, because it is the chief principle of destruction, and its mode of fighting is more amalgamated with that of the infantry. 4. that artillery being the strongest arm as regards to destructive action, and cavalry the weakest in that respect, the question must in general arise, how much artillery can we have without inconvenience, and what is the least proportion of cavalry we require? End of Book 5, Chapters 1 through 4. Book 5, Chapters 5 and 6 of On War, Volumes 2 and 3, by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by J.J. Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Book 5, Chapter 5, Order of Battle of an Army. The order of battle is that division and formation of the different arms into separate parts or sections of the whole army, and that form of general position or disposition of those parts, which is to be the norm throughout the whole campaign or war. It consists, therefore, in a certain measure, of an arithmetical and a geometrical element, the division and the form of disposition. The first proceeds from the permanent peace organisation of the army, adopts as units certain parts, such as battalions, squadrons, and batteries, and with them forms units of a higher order, up to the highest of all, the whole army, according to the requirements of predominating circumstances. In like manner, the form of disposition comes from the elementary tactics in which the army is instructed and exercised in time of peace, which must be looked upon as a property in the troops that cannot be essentially modified at the moment war breaks out. The disposition connects these tactics with the conditions which the use of troops in war and in large masses demands, and thus it settles in a general way the rule or norm in conformity with which the troops are to be drawn up for battle. This has been invariably the case when great armies have taken the field, and there have been times when this form was considered as the most essential part of the battle. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when the improvements in the firearms of infantry occasioned a great increase of that arm, and allowed of its being deployed in such long thin lines, the order of battle was thereby simplified, but at the same time it became more difficult and more artificial in the carrying out, and as no other way of disposing of the cavalry at the commencement of a battle was known but that of posting them on the wings, where they were out of the fire and had room to move, therefore in order of battle the army always became a closed inseparable whole. If such an army was divided in the middle, it was like an earthworm cut in two. The wings still had life and the power of motion, but they had lost their natural functions. The army lay, therefore, in a manner under a spell of unity, and whenever any parts of it had to be placed in a separate position, a small organisation and disorganisation became necessary. The marches which the whole army had to make were a condition in which, to a certain extent, it found itself out of rule. If the enemy was at hand, the march had to be arranged in the most artificial manner, and in order that one line or one wing might be always at the prescribed distance from the other, the troops had to scramble over everything. Marches had to be constantly stolen from the enemy, and this perpetual theft only escaped severe punishment through one circumstance, which was that the enemy lay under the same ban. Hence, when in the later half of the 18th century it was discovered that cavalry would serve just as well to protect a wing if it stood in rear of the army as if it were placed on the prolongation of the line, and that besides this it might be applied to other purposes than merely fighting a duel with the enemy's cavalry, a great step in advance was made, because now the army in its principal extension or front, which is always the breadth of its order of battle (position), consisted entirely of homogeneous members, so that it could be formed of any number of parts at pleasure, each part like another and like the whole. In this way it ceased to be one single piece and became an articulated whole, consequently pliable and manageable. The parts might be separated from the whole and then joined on again without difficulty. The order of battle always remained the same. Thus arose the corps consisting of all arms, that is, such an organisation became possible, for the want of it had been felt long before. That all this relates to the combat is very natural. The battle was formerly the whole war, and will always continue to be the principal part of it, but the order of battle belongs generally more to tactics than strategy, and it is only introduced here to show how tactics, in organising the whole into smaller wholes, made preparations for strategy. The greater armies become, the more they are distributed over wide spaces, and the more diversified the action and reaction of the different parts amongst themselves, the wider becomes the field of strategy, and therefore then the order of battle, in the sense of our definition, must also come into a kind of reciprocal action with strategy, which manifests itself chiefly at the extreme points where tactics and strategy meet, that is, at those moments when the general distribution of the combatant forces passes into the special dispensations for the combat. We now turn to those 3 points, the division, combination of arms, and order of battle (disposition), in a strategic point of view. 1. Division. In strategy, we must never ask what is to be the strength of a division or a corps, but how many corps or divisions an army should have. There is nothing more unmanageable than an army divided into 3 parts, except it be one divided into only 2, in which case the chief command must always be neutralised. To fix the strength of great and small corps, either on the grounds of elementary tactics or on higher grounds, leaves an incredibly wide field for arbitrary judgment, and heaven knows what strange modes of reasoning have sported in this wide field. On the one hand, the necessity of forming an independent whole (army) in a certain number of parts is a thing as obvious as it is positive, and this idea furnishes real strategic motives for determining the number of the greater divisions of an army, consequently their strength, whilst the strength of the smaller divisions, such as companies, battalions, etc., is left to be determined by tactics. We can hardly imagine the smallest independent body in which there are not at least 3 parts to be distinguished, that one part may be thrown out in advance, and another part be left in the rear. That 4 is still more convenient follows of itself, if we keep in view that the middle part, being the principal division, ought to be stronger than either of its others. In this way we proceed to make out 8, which appears to us to be the most suitable number for an army. If we take 1 part for an advanced guard as a constant necessity, 3 for the main body, that is a right wing, centre and left wing, 2 divisions for reserve, and 1 to detach to the right, 1 to the left. Without pedantically ascribing a great importance to these numbers and figures, we certainly believe that they represent the most usual and frequently recurring strategic disposition, and on that account one that is convenient. Certainly it seems the supreme direction of an army and the direction of every whole must be greatly facilitated if there are only 3 or 4 subordinates to command, but the commander-in-chief must pay dearly for this convenience in a twofold manner. In the first place, an order loses its rapidity, force and exactness if the gradation ladder down which it has to descend is long, and this must be the case if there are corps commanders between the division's leaders and the chief. Secondly, the chief generally loses his own proper power and efficiency the wider the sphere of action of his immediate subordinates become. A general commanding 100,000 men in 8 divisions exercises a power which is greater in intensity than if the 100,000 men were divided into only 3 corps. There are many reasons for this, but the most important is that each commander looks upon himself as having a kind of proprietary right in his own corps, and always opposes the withdrawal from him of any portion of it for a longer or shorter time. A little experience of war will make this evident to anyone. But on the other hand, the number of divisions must not be too great, otherwise disorder will ensue. It is difficult enough to manage 8 divisions from one headquarter, and the number should never be allowed to exceed 10. But in a division in which the means of circulating orders are much less, the smaller normal number 4, or at most 5, must be regarded as the more suitable. If these factors 5 and 10 will not answer, that is, if the brigades are too strong, then the corps d'armée must be introduced. But we must remember that by doing so a new power is created which at once very much lowers all other factors. But now, what is too strong a brigade? The custom is to make them from 2,000 to 5,000 men strong, and there appear to be 2 reasons for making the latter number the limit. The first is that a brigade is supposed to be a subdivision which can be commanded by one man directly, that is, through the compass of his voice. The second is that any larger body of infantry should not be left without artillery, and through this first combination of arms a special division itself is formed. We do not wish to involve ourselves in these tactical subtleties, neither shall we enter upon the disputed point where and in what proportions the combination of all 3 arms should take place, whether with divisions of 8,000 to 12,000 men, or with corps which are 20,000 to 30,000 men strong. The most decided opponent of these combinations will scarcely take exception at the mere assertion that nothing but this combination of the three arms can make a division independent, and that therefore, for such as are intended to be frequently detached separately, it is at very least desirable. An army of 200,000 men in 10 divisions, the divisions composed of 5 brigades each, would give brigades of 4,000 strong. We see here no disproportion. Certainly this army might also be divided into 5 corps, the corps into 4 divisions, and the division into 4 brigades, which makes the brigade 2,500 men strong. But the first distribution looked at in the abstract appears to us preferable, for besides that in the other there is one more gradation of rank, 5 parts are too few to make an army manageable. 4 divisions, in like manner, are too few for a corps, and 2,500 men is a weak brigade, of which in this manner there are 80, whereas the first formation has only 50 and is therefore simpler. All these advantages are given up merely for the sake of having only to send orders to half as many generals. Of course, the distribution into corps is still more unsuitable for smaller armies. This is the abstract view of the case. The particular case may present good reasons for deciding otherwise. Likewise, we must admit that although 8 or 10 divisions may be directed when united in a level country, in widely extended mountain positions, the thing might perhaps be impossible. A great river which divides an army into halves makes a commander of each half indispensable. In short, there are 100 local and particular objects of the most decisive character before which any rules must give way. But still, experience teaches us that these abstract grounds come most frequently into use, and are seldomer overruled by others than we should perhaps suppose. We wish further to explain clearly the scope of the foregoing considerations by a simple outline, for which purpose we now place the different points of most importance next to each other. As we mean by the term numbers, or parts of a whole, only those which are made by the primary, therefore the immediate division, we say, 1. If a whole has too few members, it is unwieldy. 2. If the parts of the whole body are too large, the power of the superior will is thereby weakened. 3. With every additional step through which an order has to pass, it is weakened in 2 ways. In one way by the loss of force, which it suffers in its passage through an additional step, in another way by the longer time in its transmission. The tendency of all this is to show that the number of co-ordinate divisions should be as great, and the gradational steps as few as possible, and the only limitation to this conclusion is that in armies no more than from 8 to 10, and in subordinate corps no more than from 4 to at most 6 subdivisions can be conveniently directed. 2. Combination of arms. For strategy, the combination of the 3 arms in the order of battle is only important as regard to those parts of the army which, according to the usual order of things, are likely to be frequently employed in a detached position where they may be obliged to engage in an independent combat. Now, it is in the nature of things that the members of the first class, and for the most part only these, are destined for detached positions, because, as we shall see elsewhere, detached positions are most generally adopted upon the supposition and the necessity of a body independent in itself. In a strict sense, strategy would therefore only require a permanent combination of arms in an army corps, or where these do not exist, in divisions, leaving it to circumstances to determine when a provisional combination of the 3 arms shall be made in subdivisions of an inferior order. But it is easy to see that when corps are to be of considerable size, such as 30,000 or 40,000 men, they can seldom find themselves in a situation to take up a completely connected position in mass. With corps of such strength, a combination of the arms in the divisions is therefore necessary. No one who has any experience in war will treat lightly the delay which occurs when pressing messages have to be sent to some other, perhaps distant point, before cavalry can be brought to the support of the infantry, to say nothing of the confusion which takes place. The details of the combination of the 3 arms, how far it should extend and how far down it should be carried, what proportion should be observed, the strength of the reserves of each to be set apart, these are all purely tactical considerations. 3. The disposition. The determination as to the relations in space according to which the parts of an army amongst themselves are to be drawn up in order of battle is likewise completely a tactical subject referring solely to the battle. No doubt there is also a strategic disposition of the parts, but it depends almost entirely upon determinations and requirements of the moment, and what there is in it of the rational does not come within the meaning of the term order of battle. We shall therefore treat of it in the following chapter under the head of Disposition of an army. The order of battle of an army is therefore the organisation and disposition of it in mass, ready prepared for battle. Its parts are united in such a manner that both the tactical and strategical requirements of the moment can be easily satisfied by the employment of single parts drawn from the general mass. When such momentary exigency has passed over, these parts resume their original places, and thus the order of battle becomes the first step to, and principal foundation of, that wholesome methodicism which, like the beat of a pendulum, regulates the work in war, and of which we have already spoken in the 4th chapter of the 2nd book. Chapter 6. General disposition of an army. Between the moment of the first assembling of military forces and that of the solution arrived at maturity, when strategy has brought the army to the decisive point, and each particular part has had its position and role pointed out by tactics, there is in most cases a long interval. It is the same between one decisive catastrophe and another. Formerly, these intervals in a certain measure did not belong to war at all. Take, for example, the manner in which Luxembourg encamped and marched. We single out this general because he is celebrated for his camps and marches, and therefore may be considered a representative general of his period, and from the Histoire de la Flandre militaire we know more about him than about other generals of the time. The camp was regularly pitched with its rear close to a river, or a morass, or a deep valley, which in the present day would be considered madness. The direction in which the enemy lay had so little to do with determining the front of the army that cases are very common in which the rear was towards the enemy, and thus the front towards their own country. Now, this unheard of mode of proceeding is perfectly unintelligible, unless we suppose that in the choice of camps the convenience of the troops was the chief, indeed almost the only consideration, and therefore look upon the state of being in camp as a state outside of the action of war, a kind of withdrawal behind the scenes, where one is quite at ease. The practice of always resting the rear upon some obstacle may be reckoned the only measure of security which was then taken. Of course, in the sense of the mode of conducting war in that day, for such a measure was quite inconsistent with the possibility of being compelled to fight in that position. But there was little reason for apprehension on that score, because the battle is generally depended on a kind of mutual understanding, like a duel, in which the parties repair to a convenient rendezvous. As armies, partly on account of their numerous cavalry, which in the decline of its splendour was still regarded, particularly by the French, as the principal arm, partly on account of the unwieldy organisation of their order of battle, could not fight in every description of country. An army in a close broken country was, as it were, under the protection of a neutral territory, and it could itself make but little use of broken ground. Therefore, it was deemed preferable to go to meet an enemy seeking battle. We know, indeed, that Luxembourg's battles at Fleurus, Steinkirk, and Neerwinden were conceived in a different spirit, but this spirit had only just then, under this great general, freed itself from the old method, and it had not yet reacted on the method of encampment. Alterations in the art of war originate always in matters of a decisive nature, and then lead by degrees to modifications in other things. The expression "il va à la guerre," used in reference to a partisan setting out to watch the enemy, shows how little the state of an army in camp was considered to be a state of real warfare. It was not much otherwise with the marches, for the artillery then separated itself completely from the rest of the army in order to take advantage of better and more secure roads, and the cavalry on the wings generally took the right alternately, that each might have in turn its share of the honour of marching on the right. At present (that is, chiefly since the Silesian wars), the situation out of battle is so thoroughly influenced by its connection with battle that the two states are in intimate correlation, and the one can no longer be completely imagined without the other. Formerly in a campaign the battle was the real weapon, the situation at other times only the handle, the former the steel blade, the other the wooden haft glued to it, the whole therefore composed of heterogeneous parts. Now the battle is the edge, the situation out of the battle the back of the blade, the whole to be looked upon as metal completely welded together, in which it is impossible any longer to distinguish where the steel ends and the iron begins. The state in war outside of the battle is now partly regulated by the organisation and regulations with which the army comes prepared from a state of peace, partly by the tactical and strategic arrangements of the moment. The three situations in which an army may be placed are in quarters, on a march, or in camp. All three belong as much to tactics as to strategy, and these two branches bordering on each other here in many ways often seem to, or actually do, incorporate themselves with each other, so that many dispositions may be looked upon at the same time as both tactical and strategic. We shall treat of these situations of an army outside of the combat in a general way before any special objects come into connection with them, but we must first of all consider the general disposition of forces, because that is a superior and more comprehensive measure, determining as respects camps, cantonments and marches. If we look at the disposition of the forces in a general way, that is, leaving out of sight any special object, we can only imagine it as a unit, that is, as a whole, intended to fight all together, for any deviation from this simplest form would imply a special object. Thus arises, therefore, the conception of an army, let it be small or large. Further, when there is an absence of any special end, there only remains as the sole object the preservation of the army itself, which of course includes its security. That the army shall be able to exist without inconvenience, and that it should be able to concentrate without difficulty for the purpose of fighting, are, therefore, the two requisite conditions. From these result as desirable the following points, more immediately applying to subjects concerning the existence and security of the army. 1. Facility of subsistence. 2. Facility of providing shelter for the troops. 3. Security of the rear. 4. An open country in front. 5. The position itself in broken country. 6. Strategic points d'appui. 7. A suitable distribution of the troops. The first two lead us to seek out cultivated districts and great towns and roads. They determine measures in general rather than in particular. In the chapter on lines of communication will be found what we mean by security of the rear. The first and most important point in this respect is that the centre of this position should be at a right angle with the principal line of retreat adjoining the position. Respecting the fourth point, an army certainly cannot look over an expanse of country in its front as it overlooks the space directly before it when in a tactical position for battle. But the strategic eyes are the advanced guard, scouts and patrols sent forward, spies, etc., etc., and the service will naturally be easier for these in an open than in an intersected country. The fifth point is merely the reverse of the fourth. Strategical points d'appui differ from tactical in these two respects: that the army need not be in immediate contact with them, and that, on the other hand, they must be of greater extent. The cause of this is that, according to the nature of the thing, the relations of time in space in which strategy moves are generally on a greater scale than those of tactics. If, therefore, an army posts itself at a distance of a mile from the sea coast or the banks of a great river, it leans strategically on these obstacles, for the enemy cannot make use of such space as this to effect a strategic turning movement. Within its narrow limits he cannot adventure on marches miles in length, occupying days and weeks. On the other hand, in strategy, a lake of several miles in circumference is hardly to be looked upon as an obstacle. In its proceedings, a few miles to the right and left are not of much consequence. Fortresses will become strategic points d'appui according as they are large and afford a wide sphere of action for offensive combinations. The disposition of the army in separate masses may be done with a view either to special objects and requirements, or those of a general nature. Here we can only speak of the latter. The first general necessity is to push forward the advanced guard and the other troops required to watch the enemy. The second is that, with very large armies, the reserves are usually placed several miles in the rear, and consequently occupy a separate position. Lastly, the covering of both wings of an army usually requires a separate disposition of particular corps. By this covering it is not at all meant that a portion of the army is to be detached to defend the space round its wings, in order to prevent an enemy from approaching these weak points, as they are called. Who would then defend the wings of these flanking corps? This kind of idea, which is so common, is complete nonsense. The wings of an army are in themselves not weak points of an army for this reason, that the enemy also has wings, and cannot menace ours without placing its own in jeopardy. It is only if circumstances are unequal, if the enemy's army is larger than ours, if his lines of communication are more secure (see lines of communication), it is only then that the wings become weak points. But of these special cases we are not now speaking, therefore neither of a case in which a flanking corps is appointed in connection with other combinations to defend effectually the space on our wings, for that no longer belongs to the category of general dispositions. But although the wings are not particularly weak parts, still they are particularly important, because here, on account of flanking movements, the defence is not so simple as in front. Measures are more complicated and require more time and preparation. For this reason it is necessary in the majority of cases to protect the wings specially against unforeseen enterprises on the part of the enemy, and this is done by placing stronger masses on the wings than would be required for mere purposes of observation. To press heavily these masses, even if they oppose no very serious resistance, more time is required, and the stronger they are, the more the enemy must develop his forces and his intentions, and by that means the object of the measure is attained. What is to be done further depends on the particular plans of the moment. We may therefore regard corps placed on the wings as lateral advanced guards, intended to retard the advance of the enemy through the space beyond our wings, and give us time to make dispositions to counter his movement. If these corps are to fall back on the main body, and the latter is not to make a backward movement at the same time, then it follows of itself that they must not be in the same line with the front of the main body, but thrown out somewhat forwards, because when a retreat is to be made, even without being preceded by a serious engagement, they should not retreat directly on the side of the position. From these reasons of a subjective nature, as they relate to the inner organisation of the army, there arises a natural system of disposition composed of 4 or 5 parts, according as the reserve remains with the main body or not. As the subsistence and shelter of the troops partly decide the choice of a position in general, so also they contribute to its disposition in separate divisions. The attention which they demand comes into consideration along with other considerations mentioned above, and we seek to satisfy the one without prejudice to the other. In most cases, by the division of an army into 5 separate corps, the difficulties of subsistence and quartering will be overcome, and no great alteration will afterwards be required on their account. We have still to cast a glance at the distance at which these separated corps may be allowed to be placed, if we are to retain in view the advantage of mutual support, and therefore of concentrating for battle. On this subject we remind our readers of what is said in the chapters on the duration and decision of the combat, according to which no absolute distance, but only the most general, as it were, average rules can be given, because absolute and relative strength of arms and country have a great influence. The distance of the advanced guard is the easiest to fix, as in retreating it falls back on the main body of the army, and therefore may be at all events at a distance of a long day's march without incurring the risk of being obliged to fight in independent battle. But it should not be sent further in advance than the security of the army requires, because the further it has to fall back, the more it suffers. Respecting corps on the flanks, as we have already said, the combat of an ordinary division of 8,000 to 10,000 men usually lasts for several hours, even for half a day, before it is decided. On that account, therefore, there need be no hesitation in placing such a division at a distance of some leagues or 1 or 2 miles, and for the same reason corps of 3 or 4 divisions may be detached a day's march or a distance of 3 or 4 miles. From this natural and general disposition of the main body in 4 or 5 divisions at particular distances, a certain method has arisen of dividing an army in a mechanical manner, wherever there are no strong special reasons against this ordinary method. But although we assume that each of these distinct parts of an army shall be competent to undertake an independent combat, and it may be obliged to engage in one, it does not therefore by any means follow that the real object of fractioning an army is that the parts should fight separately. The necessity for this distribution of the army is mostly only a condition of existence imposed by time. If the enemy approaches our position to try the fate of a general action, the strategic period is over, everything concentrates itself into the one moment of the battle, and therewith terminates and vanishes the object of the distribution of the army. As soon as the battle commences, considerations about quarters and subsistence are suspended. The observation of the enemy before our front and on our flanks has fulfilled the purpose of checking his advance by a partial resistance, and now all resolves itself into the one great unit, the great battle. The best criterion of skill in the disposition of an army lies in the proof that the distribution has been considered merely as a condition, as a necessary evil, but that the united action in battle has been considered the object of the disposition. End of On War, Volumes 2 and 3, Book 5, Chapters 5 and 6. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Book 5, Chapters 7 and 8 of On War, Volumes 2 and 3, by Carl von Clausewitz. Translated by J. Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 7. Advanced Guard and Outposts. These two bodies belong to that class of subjects into which both the tactical and strategic threads run simultaneously. On the one hand, we must reckon them amongst those provisions which give form to the battle and ensure the execution of tactical plans. On the other hand, they frequently lead to independent combats, and on account of their position, more or less distant from the main body, they are to be regarded as links in the strategic chain, and it is this very feature which obliges us to supplement the preceding chapter by devoting a few moments to their consideration. Every body of troops, when not completely in readiness for battle, requires an advanced guard, to learn the approach of the enemy, and to gain further particulars respecting his force before he comes in sight, for the range of vision as a rule does not go much beyond the range of firearms. But what sort of man would he be who could not see farther than his arms can reach? The foreposts are the eyes of the army, as we have already said. The want of them, however, is not always equally great. It has its degrees. The strength of armies and the exact ground they cover, time, place, contingencies, the method of making war, even chance, are all points which have influence in the matter, and therefore we cannot wonder that military history, instead of furnishing any definite and simple outlines of the method of using advanced guards and outposts, only presents the subject in a kind of chaos of examples of the most diversified nature. Sometimes we see the security of an army entrusted to a corps regularly appointed to the duty of advanced guard, at another time a long line of separate outposts. Sometimes both these arrangements coexist, sometimes neither one nor the other. At one time there is only one advanced guard in common for the whole of the advancing columns. At another time each column has its own advanced guard. We shall endeavour to get a clear idea of what the subject really is, and then see whether we can arrive at some principles capable of application. If the troops are on the march, a detachment of more or less strength forms its van or advanced guard, and in case of the movement of the army being reversed, this same detachment will form the rear guard. If the troops are in cantonments or camp, an extended line of weak posts forms the vanguard, the outposts. It is essentially in the nature of things that when the army is halted, a greater extent of space can and must be watched than when the army is in motion, and therefore in the one case the conception of a chain of posts, in the other that of a concentrated corps, arises of itself. The actual strength of an advanced guard, as well as of outposts, ranges from a considerable corps, composed of an organisation of all three arms, to a regiment of hussars, and from a strongly entrenched defensive line, occupied by portions of troops from each arm of the service, to mere outlying pickets and their support detached from the camp. The services assigned to such vanguards range also from those of mere observation to an offer of opposition or resistance to the enemy, and this opposition may not only be to give the main body of the army the time which it requires to prepare for battle, but also to make the enemy develop his plans and intentions, which consequently makes the observation far more important. According as more or less time is required to be gained, according as opposition to be offered is calculated upon and intended to meet the special measures of the enemy, so accordingly must the strength of the advanced guard and outposts be proportioned. Frederick the Great, a general above all others ever ready for battle, and who almost directed his army in battle by word of command, never required strong outposts. We see him therefore constantly encamping close under the eyes of the enemy, without any great apparatus of outposts, relying for his security at one place on a hussar regiment, at another on a light battalion, or perhaps on the pickets and supports furnished from the camp. On the march, a few thousand horse, generally furnished by the cavalry on the flanks of the first line, formed his advanced guard, and at the end of the march rejoined the main body. He very seldom had any corps permanently employed as advanced guard. When it is the intention of a small army, by using the whole weight of its mass with great vigour and activity, to make the enemy feel the effect of its superior discipline, and the greater resolution of its commander, then almost everything must be done sous le humble ennemi, in the same way as Frederick the Great did when opposed to Daun. A system of holding back from the enemy, and a very formal and extensive system of outposts, would neutralise all the advantages of this above kind of superiority. The circumstance that an error of another kind, and the carrying out of Frederick's system too far, may lead to a battle of Hochkirch, is no argument against this method of acting. We should rather say that as there was only one battle of Hochkirch in all of the Silesian war, we ought to recognise in this system a proof of the king's consummate ability. Napoleon, however, who commanded an army not deficient in discipline and firmness, and who did not want for resolution himself, never moved without a strong advanced guard. There are two reasons for this. The first is to be found in the alteration in tactics. A whole army is no longer led into battle as one body by mere word of command, to settle the affair like a great duel of more or less skill and bravery. The combatants on each side now range their forces more to suit the peculiarities of the ground and circumstances, so that the order of battle, and consequently the battle itself, is a whole made up of many parts, from which there follows that the simple determination to fight becomes a regularly formed plan, and the word of command a more or less long preparatory arrangement. For this time and data are required. The second cause lies in the great size of modern armies. Frederick brought 30,000 or 40,000 men into battle, Napoleon from 1 to 200,000. We have selected these examples because everyone will admit that two such generals would never have adopted any systematic mode of proceeding without some good reason. Upon the whole, there has been a general improvement in the use of advanced guards and outposts in modern warfare. Not that everyone acted as Frederick, even in the Silesian wars, for at that time the Austrians had a system of strong outposts, and frequently sent forward a corps as advanced guard, for which they had sufficient reason from the situation in which they were placed. Just in the same way that we find differences enough in the mode of carrying on war in more modern times. Even the French marshals Macdonald in Silesia, Oudinot and Ney in the Mark, Brandenburg, advanced with armies of 60,000 or 70,000 men, without our reading of their having had any advanced guard. We have hitherto been discussing advanced guards and outposts in relation to their numerical strength, but there is another difference which we must settle. It is that when an army advances or retires on a certain breadth of ground, it may have a van or rear guard in common for all of the columns which are marching side by side, or each column may have one for itself. In order to form a clear idea on this subject, we must look at it this way. The fundamental conception of an advanced guard, when a corps is so specially designated, is that its mission is the security of the main body or centre of the army. If this main body is marching upon several contiguous roads, so close together that they can also easily serve for the advanced guard, and therefore be covered by it, then the flank columns naturally require no special covering. But those corps which are moving at great distances, in reality as detached corps, must provide their own vanguards. The same applies also to any of those corps which belong to the central mass, and owing to the direction that the roads may happen to take, are too far from the centre column. Therefore there will be as many advanced guards as there will be columns virtually separated from each other. If each of these advanced guards is so much weaker than one general one would be, then they fall more into the class of other tactical dispositions, and there is no advanced guard in the strategic tableau. But if the main body or centre has a much larger corps for its advanced guard, then that corps will appear as the advanced guard of the whole, and will be so in many respects. But what can be the reason for giving the centre a vanguard so much stronger than the wings? The following three reasons. 1. Because the mass of troops composing the centre is usually much more considerable. 2. Because plainly the central point of a strip of country along which the front of an army is extended must always be the most important point, as all the combinations of the campaign relate mostly to it, and therefore the field of battle is usually nearer to it than to the wings. 3. Because although a corps thrown forward in front of the centre does not directly protect the wings as a real vanguard, it still contributes greatly to their security indirectly. For instance, the enemy cannot in ordinary case pass by such a corps within a certain distance in order to effect any enterprise of importance against one of the wings, because he has to fear an attack in the flank and rear. Even if this check which a corps thrown forward in the centre becomes on the enemy is not sufficient to constitute complete security for the wings, it is in all events sufficient to relieve the flanks from all apprehension in a great many cases. The vanguard of the centre, if much stronger than that of a wing, that is to say, if it consists of a special corps as advanced guard, has then not merely the mission of a vanguard intended to protect the troops in its rear from sudden surprise, it also operates in more general strategic relations as an army corps thrown forward in advance. The following are the purposes for which such a corps may be used, and therefore those which determine its duties in practice. 1. To ensure a stouter resistance, and make the enemy advance with much more caution, consequently to do the duties of a vanguard on a greater scale, whenever our arrangements are such as to require time before they can be carried into effect. 2. If the central mass of the army is very large, to be able to keep this unwieldy body at some distance from the enemy, while we remain close to him with a more movable body of troops. 3. That we may have a corps of observation close to the enemy, if there are any other reasons which require us